To go or not to go? Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortunes, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them. Yes, Hamlet was quoted in the House of Commons today. Why? Because the Shadow Chancellor has questions to ask of Chancellor Rachel Reeves, if she will stay or if she will go. My name's Tom Harwood, and this is the GB News Originals series. Rachel Reeves addressed the House of Commons after days away from that front bench, having been to China to drum up business and try and counteract some of those market wobbles we've been seeing over the past 7 days. But did it work? Well, she was questioned over why she did not turn up in her place in the House of Commons last week to address the market wobbles as they began, as the cost of government debt began to rise, as the pound began to fall. Where was the Chancellor?
Rachel Reeves is the news again. I don't even think she left. But it is for the wrong reasons again, since Labour announced its financial plan through a budget many analysts call a disaster. Rachel Reeves has been under pressure. The big question now is, should Rachel Reeves leave her job as Deputy Chancellor, given the disastrous state of the economy? But how did things get to this level? You have to watch this video till the end to get the full details.
Their forecast for household income because of what has happened to NICs on employers, because fundamentally it does impact people's incomes, and it's just naive to pretend it doesn't.
I'm not saying that it doesn't, Emily, but what I am saying is that the choice was between increasing employee or employer national insurance.
You could have just raised 2p on the income tax altogether. You could have said, do you know
all
what?
of that,
that would be a fair tax on everyone.
No, it wouldn't, because all of that burden would have been on working people. The way that I have structured it is that businesses will pay that tax.
It's increases that they won't see now in their pay packets.
And I accept that some of that burden will be felt on employees. But if I had an increased employee national insurance or income tax, all of the burden.
But instead of choosing to come and face the music, she decided to send an underling, Darren Jones, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, to face that question instead. So it's been days upon days until we've had the chance to hear what the Chancellor thinks about her plan going belly up. Why has her plan gone belly up? Her entire shtick as Chancellor and as Shadow Chancellor was to be Mrs. Stability. Yes, Rachel Reeves, in the wake of the mini-budget under Liz Truss, said that Labour was the party that would deliver financial stability, that would deliver a lower cost of borrowing. However, what's happened in the last 7 days? Precisely the opposite. The value of the pound has fallen, and gilt yields, the amount the government has to pay to borrow money from the international markets, and given we borrow so much money, given our deficit is so large.
Today in the House of Commons, Hamlet was quoted as to be or not to be when the Shadow Chancellor spoke about Rachel Reeves' apparent refusal to appear before the MPs and spoke about the fallout of her budget and its impact on the British economy. To understand how it got to this point, we have to take back a little. Rachel Reeves finally appeared before the House of Commons after days away from the front bench because she went to China. The visit was to drum up business to counteract the market wobbles, such as rising borrowing costs caused by her disastrous budget.
And hit twice by changes in 1995 and then again in 2011 have been done an injustice. As Shadow Pensions Minister in 2011, I was proud to work with Age UK, the trade union USDOR, and very many women, including my mother, to call on the government to think again. And we were pleased then to win a partial concession so that no woman had to wait for more than an extra 18 months before they could claim their pension. But I said then, and I say again today, that it does not go far enough in righting this wrong. There are still 2.6 million women who have lost out as a result of the government rewriting the rules, of whom 300,000 will have to wait an extra 18 months before they can retire. Last week I caught up with Barbara Bates, who lives in County Durham, who I campaigned with in 2011. Even after the government's concession, Barbara still faces working an extra 78 weeks before she will see her state pension. The osteoarthritis affecting her wrists and her thumbs when I first got to know her 5 years ago has now spread to her hands, her knees, her neck and her right foot. She said, "No government can change the way our bodies age, and in particular those of us who started work at 15 in the 70s, a lifetime of menial and heavy jobs that are vital but unnoticed." Like other members, I've also been contacted by constituents. This morning, Margaret Cutty phoned me during her office tea break. She works mostly on her feet, but with lots of lifting as well, and in the past year she has had 3 operations. Her husband has just had a triple heart bypass, and she wants to be able to spend more time caring for him as he grows older. Because of these changes, she won't be able to do that.
But did it work? Then she was questioned why she didn't turn up to address the market wobbles last week at the House of Commons. As the cost of government debts began to rise, as the GB pounds began to fall, where was the Chancellor? These questions were brought before the MPs, and rather than addressing them herself, Reeves sent her deputy. However, new information has emerged that Rachel Reeves was in the country at the time the questions were asked, but chose to send a subordinate, Darren Jones, Chief Secretary to the Treasury, to answer questions meant for her.
And next week, I will be meeting with business leaders, investors and entrepreneurs at the World Economic Forum meeting in Davos to make the case that the UK is one of the best places in the world to...
Was this intentional, a way to avoid facing the music for an apparent bad policy? But the biggest question is, why has the entire economic plan of Reeves gone belly up? Throughout her time as Shadow Chancellor and before the election, Rachel Reeves had maintained she was going to be the one to stabilise the economy. She was called Mrs. Stability. In the wake of the mini-budget under Liz Truss, said that Labour was the party that would deliver financial stability and lower the cost of borrowing. However, in the last 7 days, the story has become completely different. The value of the pound has fallen, and the amount the government has to pay to borrow money from the international market has risen to £12 billion. Yes, the amount the government has to pay to service the debt of the country has risen to new heights since the budget was announced by Rachel Reeves.
It seems to be that things have not gone in the direction that the Chancellor would like. How far have things gone south? Well, since the budget, the amount the government has to pay just to service the debt of this country has risen to £12 billion. That's billion with a B. Yes, the government is now having to shell out 12 billion more than it previously thought it would, simply to service its own debt.
The result is that the government now pays £1 billion more than in previous years to service its debt. So it didn't help that Reeves raised 20 billion extra borrowing in this year's budget. Shockingly, by the end of her budget forecast, the borrowing will be 40 billion. While the tax of her first budget has made the most headlines, the borrowing is worth talking about too. Of course, Rachel Reeves changed the debt rule to enable her to borrow more, and that is exactly what she did. Tens of billions more in borrowing, which raises the taxes to unprecedented heights.
That I've always wanted to do is to be Chancellor of the Exchequer. I was an economist at the Bank of England for many years before I became an MP. I worked in financial services. I know how to run a successful economy. And I wanted to be an economist after finishing at university. The economy growing, and that has been the missing ingredient these last 13 years. Now, you know, Phil sort of says, oh, I'm an ex-banker. Yes, I am an ex-Bank of England economist. COVID. I mean, what a nightmare. So I have 45 minutes, basically, to prepare my speech. Now, my background is as an economist, and I think I put that to good use. I first came to Washington, as you said, a little over 20 years ago. As a young economist at the Bank of England, I was seconded to the British Embassy here in Washington. And I always feel that every generation of women are sort of standing on the shoulders of those who have gone before us. But it also made me reflect that in all my time working as an economist at the bank and in the private sector, I spent the best part of a decade as an economist at the Bank of England. Granted operational independence to the Bank of England. I started my career as an economist at the bank. Things that add up. You know, I started my career as an economist at the Bank of England. I know how important it is to have low and stable inflation and predictable interest rates. When I worked at the Bank of England as an economist, those are things that I would take into this job as Chancellor. The numbers have always got to add up. But haven't they?
result is that businesses, especially the smaller ones, are blaming the government for dumping all the pain on business. That seems to have dampened the growth rate that some analysts suggest has risen inflation too, as businesses are passing the higher costs of production to the final consumer through price increases.
About the borrowing, of course, she changed the debt rule to allow her to borrow more. And borrow more she did, tens of billions more of borrowing, as well as tens of billions more in tax rises. The tax rises, of course, have pummeled business. The business group, the CBI, has been criticising the government for lumping all of the pain on business, and that seems to have dampened the growth rate. There's some analysis that suggests it's risen inflation too, as these businesses pass their higher costs onto those prices that you and I pay when we go to buy things. So what then happens? What happens next? Well,
overall, businesses have pummeled, and the result is more borrowing. When you have more borrowing, the economy suffers. As borrowing goes up, more money slashes across the economy, and the result is higher prices and rising inflation. The problem isn't just for those in the UK. The market has also taken a weary eye to the country, wondering if it is safe to invest in it. Now, if the international market is doubting the viability of the UK's economy, the cost of debt rises.
Place that money, the cost of debt rises. And then the Chancellor has a horrible situation. How does she solve that 12 billion extra that she has to pay for debt interest that she didn't think that she'd have to pay for debt interest? Well, she can either make £12 billion of cuts or raise £12 billion more of spending. But it might not be £12 billion. We don't know how much higher these borrowing costs could go. The Chancellor, frankly, is in a bind.
So the Chancellor will have a horrible situation on her hands. How will she overcome the £12 billion in debt servicing that she didn't think would come up? Well, she can either cut government spending by that amount or raise taxes to cover that amount. But the amount may be higher than £12 billion. Frankly, the Chancellor is in an unenviable position and has to find a way to enhance economic growth. But taxes are not a solution to the problem. More taxes often lead to less growth. Interestingly, Reeves has always said that growth is the top priority of the government. However, the numbers suggest that growth is lower today than it was before the budget, according to the Independent Budget Office. So, where do we go from here? There were suggestions in the House of Commons that an emergency budget as soon as this spring. Could that be the case? A budget after only 6 months to deal with the extra cost that is piled upon the Treasury? It is a grim picture, but you need to listen to Shadow Chancellor Mel Stride explain the situation further.
Mr. Speaker, I know that the Chancellor has been away, so let me update her on the mess that she left behind. The pound has hit a 14-month low. Government borrowing costs are at a 27-year high. Growth has been killed stone dead. Inflation is rising, impacting millions. Interest rates are staying higher for longer, and business confidence has fallen through the floor. The party opposite talked down the economy. They crippled businesses with colossal taxes, breaking all their promises. This is a crisis made in Downing Street. And Mr. Speaker, it should hardly surprise the Chancellor that international markets are uneasy. The UK's long-term borrowing costs have risen to their highest in almost 30 years. But while the government was losing control of the economy, Mr. Speaker, where was the Chancellor? Her trip to China had not even begun when my urgent question was taken in the House last week. She was still in the country. Well, whatever was on the menu in China, was it really worth the unedifying sight of an increasingly desperate politician scampering halfway around the world with a begging bowl? Was it really worth it? The Chancellor's deal pales in comparison to Labour's black hole, which has opened up in the public finances while the Right Honourable Lady was absent from her station. To give a sense of scale, Mr. Speaker, the deal the Chancellor has announced amounts to £120 million per year. The rise in our borrowing costs due to her disastrous budget has added around £12 billion to our annual spending on debt interest alone. Literally 100 times what she says she has brought back from Beijing. That is money that cannot now go on the public's priorities. 12 billion is enough to pay for 300,000 nurses, to cover Labour's pernicious winter fuel payments cut for 8.5 years. And of course, even before this latest market reaction, the budget meant spending tens of billions more in servicing our debt. According to the OBR forecast, 2/3 of the money raised from the Chancellor's jobs tax will be swallowed up by additional debt interest. Forget those billions going on better public services. They are going on paying the price of Labour's mismanagement. And we on this side know how this sorry story goes. We have seen it, Mr. Speaker. We have seen it all before. Socialist governments that think they can tax and spend their way to prosperity. Labour governments that simply do not understand that if you tax the living daylights out of business, you will get stagnation. They do not understand, Mr. Speaker, because there's barely a shred of business experience on the front bench opposite.
In response, Rachel Reeves said it not reasonable to suggest she was at fault for the market nervousness, as borrowing costs were rising in other countries too. She told the House of Commons that the economic headwinds being faced by the UK meant the government had to go further and faster in our plan to kickstart economic growth.
That she is now in breach of her own fiscal rules. Will she cancel promised spending? Will she ramp up borrowing? Or will she raise taxes yet again? Mr. Speaker, this whole sorry tale is nothing short of a Shakespearean tragedy, playing out before our eyes. This is the Hamlet of our time. They promised the electorate much while pouring the poison into their ear. At the end, you can feel the end. The Chancellor flailing, estranged it seems from those closest to her, those about her falling, the drums beating ever closer. To go or not to go, that is now a question. The Prime Minister will be damned if he does, but he will surely be damned if he does not. The British people deserve better.
Growth is the #1 mission of this Labour government, and to grow the economy, we need to help great British businesses export around the world. That includes to China.
Reeves is facing one of the most difficult periods in her 6 months in office, with investors dumping UK bonds and the pound amid concerns about low growth in Britain and abroad. The government sold PSO Ben worth of new bonds on Tuesday on the most expensive terms since 2004. Experts said the recent increase in UK borrowing costs had all but wiped out the headroom Reeves had against her fiscal targets, leaving her looking for further tax rises or spending cuts to make up the shortfall. Treasury sources said that if confronted with that choice, Reeves would choose another round of cuts, even with unprotected departments already being asked to make average reductions of 1.3% every year after 2026. The Chancellor insisted on Tuesday she would never miss her targets, saying, "We remain committed to those fiscal rules, and we will meet them at all times." Ian Porter, a senior policy advisor at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, said, "The Chancellor has created a hole for herself, but fixing that should not be on the backs of some of the most vulnerable people in society. Trying to fix the fact that the Chancellor has boxed herself in by making even bigger cuts is wrong." What do you think of Rachel Reeves' economic policies? Do you agree with the Shadow Chancellor Mel Stride? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.